Great. So, indeed, thank you for the invitation. I've been looking forward to meeting the whole of the network as well, and I've obviously known you for a while now. Hopefully I'll get to meet you in person later on this year at OCCPN in Wellington as well. But when we were talking about what we could do with this workshop, I think the idea we arrived at was talking about how researchers can engage really with the world of regulation. And it's one thing that's kind of been a mainstay of my academic life from the PhD all the way to now. And I think to me, the reason why I find it so useful is because the regulators are a great piece to move or to catalyze when we're really trying to drive some kind of corporate response on climate change. Now, obviously, that opens up a much bigger debate, if you want it, about where corporations fit in this whole action on climate change space. But if you think they have a role to play, then the regulators are quite a useful focal point because of the amount of influence they have, not only on driving what looks like good practice and leadership, but also really the laggards who take more of a stick to drive sometimes. So I'm Dr. Robert Charnock. I'm the director of the Metis Institute for Climate Strategy, which is a privately funded research institute funded by a group called RSK. They're a large environmental engineering company. But even though it's privately funded, we have research independence and mostly work with universities, particularly in Singapore. So very much kind of that independence where we try to be a bridge. I'll come on to what we are actually in a few slides. So just as a bit of background, what I'll do is give a quick introduction to myself and Metis, move on to kind of my route from starting the PhD to where I am now, because that covers a few different routes, I think, through academia. I want to focus on one specific project just to give something a bit more tangible to engagements with regulators, and that's a recent project for the UK's Financial Reporting Council. And then I'll open it up a little bit more to talk about broader trends that I'm seeing within this exact space, since this is a climate change network, but also then reflecting on the kind of links that you can see between research and policy, research and regulation as well, before wrapping up with what the future holds for Metis and a few discussion points as well. So by way of background, I'm Rob. I started my PhD a fair while ago because my thing was I wanted to understand more about the climate change space and what somebody from an accounting and finance background could do to make a potentially useful contribution to something here. Not to fix the whole problem, but to be doing some work that maybe has a small amount of impact on some aspect of the issue. That PhD led me to working with the United Nations on developing a new carbon accounting standard for the financial sector. And that was at the whole time where this debate about climate risk was taking off. So if you like, the few years leading up to TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, being launched. So to me, it represented a kind of turning point where you saw regulators starting to pay a lot of attention and the financial sector starting to take it seriously, which is compared to the start of my PhD, where both of those groups were saying, we don't think this is a problem. And that U-turn took place within just a few years. It was amazing to watch and be part of the discussions where you saw how that impacted the world of standard setting, for example, as well. After finishing the PhD, I joined the University of Birmingham to help build the Lloyds Bank Group for Responsible Business there. I was also a lecturer in accounting during those years. So that was fantastic, getting to work close with people like Professor Ian Thompson and Jan Beddington, the kind of some of the sustainability crowd from the UK. Well, I suppose Jan's from New Zealand. And then now I've also moved to Singapore, which is, again, this kind of, to me, it's an opportunity to conduct research that is leveraging all of the great academic work that's out there, the rigor that comes from academic training, but to design research projects that are more focused on the problems that regulators or maybe business are grappling with right now. And within 6 to 9 months, have an authoritative report out there that drives that debate forward. And it's more, it's informed, it's got that depth of evidence, and it's got different perspectives that academia can bring to some of these issues as well. So we still do the academic publication side of it, but the impact of our work is more focused on these reports that are designed to inform the current debates and getting those out quickly and following them up later with the academic publications once they've gone through the peer review process. That, as you will know, takes more time than that. Now, I do have to give a nod to our funders, RSK, because they've been most generous in funding us. And again, they're very much on board with this idea of bridging the gap between, and I call it a gap because it's the easiest way of talking about it, but I know a lot of academics bridge this gap themselves as well, between academic insight, academic rigor, and the challenges faced by regulators, policymakers, and business. And the reason they were on board with this, at least from where I was sat, is because they are an environmental engineering company that have realized that the work they've done for the past few decades has broadly linked to the Sustainable Development Goals in different ways. And with the traction that the SDGs have been receiving recently, has made them rethink their business model and how they can restructure it in the next 10 years to be more aligned with that kind of thinking. So having research that's hopefully at the forefront of climate change then was an obvious one aspect of that and one part of the debate that they feel is already impacting all of their work in such a significant way. Now, that's not to say other aspects of the SDGs aren't, because they work around the world, but really, yeah, it's a focal point to begin with. So relatively large company, one of the larger companies people tend not to have heard of because they operate as a group of companies. They have about 150, maybe 180 companies that operate under the RSK group now. And so, yeah, you've probably heard of one of the companies there, shall we say, and they try to cover the whole sustainability space. But back to the kind of research background, I mentioned briefly about this fieldwork during my PhD. And what I wanted to try and capture before moving into some of the more recent work was really the core of my own research. And if I was to put it in a really simple one sentence, I really just try to say how accounting can be mobilized to drive corporate action on climate change. That's, you know, I am proud to be an accountant. I think it's a hidden infrastructure that has a huge amount of influence over the entire world. But at the same time, I think as well, you need so many different solutions to an issue like climate change that my take is probably simplistic, but if I know about accounting, let's look at what we can do with that, because we'll need many solutions from many different places. And what I saw during the PhD was how that could influence thinking in the financial sector. And the reason that that to me mattered is, if you think about the world of finance, well, they have an entire different kind of influence over the market, over business. They have a very direct way of influencing business practice. If we get to a point where financing is linked to ESG performance, then that's a fascinating turn of events, and we're starting to see some of that already. And really, this standard was about how can we create more transparency about the impact of investment and lending activities on greenhouse gas emissions. Fascinating project, incredibly difficult to create a carbon footprint for investment and lending activities, but we got somewhere with it. And as I said, it was at the same time as this whole debate on climate risk as well. So the question that the project ended up grappling with was really, can greenhouse gas emissions data, carbon footprints, can they inform risk management practice? And the conclusion was, in certain aspects of finance that can work, but in other areas of finance you need a whole range of other metrics as well. So what it really opened up was this debate about what is the relationship between metrics in the world of finance and managing the risks of climate change. Now, managing the risks of climate change, if people aren't in that finance space, might sound a bit dry, but at the end of the day, that is the way that you can start to influence whether finance is going into the dirty stuff or the cleaner stuff, to put it really simply. And that was the idea behind a lot of the climate risk activism, to say we need to reorient the financial sector away from the dirty stuff and in towards the cleaner stuff that we need to tackle climate change. So basically trying to make sure finance was going into the right places. And if I just try to recap my whole PhD, even though this is going back a little while now, to me, it was really kind of a fair bit of sociology in there because it was the sociology of regulation in a way. And in brief, I think what the thesis showed was a whole range of pressures being coordinated across the civil society, the media, across business and regulatory world, really focusing on saying the world has to act on climate risk. And it was only through that coordination of all of these different messages and pressures that there was really enough pressure generated on regulators to start taking action. And the reason I recap that is because when I talk about engaging with regulators, I don't see them at the top of some hierarchy. Maybe in legal terms, they have some sort of hierarchical influence on establishing requirements, but I don't see regulators, we should not be waiting for the regulators to act and wait for their leadership, because regulators respond to the broader debate in society. So our role as researchers can be to help drive and influence that debate more broadly in society so that it gains traction with regulators and thereby creates the impetus and platform for regulators to act. So a lot of work has to be done to give the regulators a basis for action. And that's where my research tends to focus. How do you help regulators take action, if you like? Which brings me on to the Financial Reporting Council. Now, I need to be very clear, I'm not speaking on behalf of the Financial Reporting Council here, if you like. I'm speaking as part of the team who, at the University of Manchester, through their business school, the Alliance Manchester Business School. And before they commissioned this research, the Financial Reporting Council had been interested in climate change. Because they'd conducted this thematic review in 2020 to look at how this space was evolving and how it would impact business and corporates going forward. So they knew there was a lot of movement, there was a lot of activity in this space. And when they reached out to the FTSE 100 and FTSE 250, when you combine them, you get the FTSE 350, so these are the biggest listed companies in the UK, the message they received was, we are being told that we need to conduct climate scenario analysis. And at the time, what they were hearing was the FTSE 100 and 250 did not know how to do that. And frankly, they were scared. Didn't know where to get started. It sounded hard work. It sounded resource demanding. So they really didn't know where to get started. So they commissioned research. We bid for that research. It was a competitive bid because there are good people out there who do this, but we were fortunate to win the bid. And what the FRC said is, even though we can't speak on their behalf, the overriding purpose of commissioning the work was to inform their future regulatory strategy. Okay, so I can't say that what we did led or will lead to anything from the FRC, but this is part of the regulatory dynamic. You need to create a knowledge base for some activity. And so that's a background to why they commissioned this research. I think it's also useful for people who haven't come across this to know what the TCFD is, because this is another major development at that point in time as well. And this is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So this was launched at during the Paris talks in 2015, late 2015, and it drove a lot of the interest in climate risk and scenario analysis, not only within the financial sector, but then more broadly in the real economy. That's what finance calls business, the real economy. And basically what TCFD requires is more like a disclosure initiative, but it's a strange disclosure initiative because it's got a lot more regulatory support. So in a lot of places it's already being mandated, which is quite unusual for this type of disclosure, but it also requires a lot of work to be done internally before that disclosure can be made. So it's quite different to sustainability reporting, but this isn't the TCFD session, so I won't go deep on that. Apart from just to say there's 4 core components across that. So really the companies have to look across 4 key areas of what they do. And what we were doing was linked to that, because within this strategy section of the TCFD, one thing that companies need to do is conduct climate scenario analysis. And basically that means if you're going to do climate scenario analysis, what you basically have to do is use 2 or 3 or 4 different visions of what the future could look like based on different warming scenarios, and ask yourself, how will that impact my business? How will that impact my supply chain, my clients, my revenue streams, my people, my employees, you know? And you need to work through, essentially, to arrive at a conclusion of what would my business look like in a 2 degrees world, in a 4 degrees world, in a 2.7 to 3.6 degrees world. And understanding that depending on which emissions pathway we're on, what are the implications for your business? So it's quite a difficult exercise for companies to do that. But the idea is that they're prepared for the future. And most regulators want companies to be prepared for the future. The difficulty is right now, we know the future will be impacted by climate change. We just don't know exactly what it's going to look like because it's the future and it's uncertain. But we're certain climate change will be one of the key factors that reshape the business landscape. And the issue regulators have sometimes is thinking, well, how do we get businesses to engage with that? Because it's not, for most businesses, it's not part of their day-to-day at the moment. Climate scenario analysis is one part of getting companies to think about climate change in a more systematic way and preparing for a future that is going to be changed by climate change. So what we did was, what we focused on was really the interviews with the FTSE 100 and 250. We did analyze all of the disclosures across the FTSE 350, which was a huge amount of work. We also ran an exploratory survey just to get a feel for what the issues were before we started those interviews. But really, these 44 interviews across 16 companies were really the key part of our work, if you like. And the purpose of this was to understand companies that had engaged with climate scenario analysis, what they found worked, what they found the issues were, what their reflections are now, having done it 2, maybe 3 times, and also interviewing companies that were in the middle of doing it for the first time and finding out where they found it really difficult to get started and what's helped them and what they want more of going forward, to really create a piece of research that could say to the regulator and to business, if you're getting started with this, here's what you can do to get started. Here's what's going to help you do it well. And here's how you need to think about the second attempt and third attempt and how this is going to keep evolving every time that you do it. So in a way, it was kind of like a guidebook we wanted to produce at the end. So not only just a dry run through of our findings, but we restructured it to mean that anybody who picks this up can read it and kind of have a general view of the steps they would need to take to do this well. Now that's useful for the regulators because they can use that as a discussion point with companies to say, our researchers found that these were the general steps taken. How does that compare to what they do? It means they could focus their work on certain aspects of the process. But also we met enough people who said, honestly, we just wanted to understand the process of doing this. Because the problem is with this space is you can often get a lot of technical handbooks that tell you how to use a technique. But what and they're fantastic. I'm not criticizing those. You need those technical handbooks. But what you often lack is the human face. How to get started. How to take your first steps. How to make this work. How to present this to your board of directors. And it's that human side that helps people get started and helps people get the most out of this type of exercise. And so that's where we really came in. How to make this work well. It's not a technical deep dive on all the intricacies of this because that existed, that was out there. But what didn't exist was how to do this well, how to get started. So that's what we focused on producing. And really, I mean, there's a lot in that report. It's a fairly big report. We condensed it as much as we could, but while meeting everything the regulators needed. But what the kind of main takeaways. One that maybe sounds obvious, but had bigger implications than we expected, was creating a new climate change working group within companies. The ones that were doing it well really found that work very well indeed. And I think the reason for that is because climate change had been seen as something within the sustainability function in a lot of companies. But this climate change working group was across multiple divisions. And you might only have 1 or 2 people on that working group who knew anything about climate change. So it meant these other divisions were being educated about climate change, being brought into that conversation, that thinking. And it also meant that the board of directors knew they could trust this working group in a different way. It wasn't just the sustainability team, but it was this broader view across the whole company. The second recommendation is quite obvious when you know anything about scenario analysis, but was important because we realized not many people realized it when they got started, which is that when you finish your first attempt at climate scenario analysis, the outcomes, one key outcome at least, has to be designing your next attempt. So let's say this year you focus on a certain aspect of your supply chain because you think it's the most important this year. The question is really, next year, what will you focus on? Next year, what's the other important aspect? Because scenario analysis works well when you iterate, when each year you choose a different focal point to really do a deep dive on. So instead of trying to do everything every year at a very superficial level, focus on the most important aspects and do a really deep dive each year. And then next year, know already what you're going to try and do. The third is kind of this point that with a lot of this work in sustainability, we create general economy-wide or even global frameworks that can be used by anybody, apparently. And once you get to a certain level of maturity, like we have with TCFD and climate scenario analysis, you find that what happens is industries need to take the lead on developing industry-specific guidance. So every company is different, but two energy companies are going to be much more similar than an energy company and a major fashion label, for example. So the energy sector, for example, can come together and produce guidance on how to do climate scenario analysis effectively. And that, it means you get more of a sharing of knowledge, a sharing of best practice, if you like. Takes a lot of the burden off companies and helps them do it well. What you need is enough independence within the kind of industry guidance to make sure that it is aligned with things like the Paris Agreement and that the science it's based on is solid. And then finally, the interesting thing is, even though TCFD is meant to be about the future of the entire company, because the debate, the kind of public discourse and the business discourse on this has been so risk focused for the last 7 years, a lot of this work focused on risk management, whereas what it also needs to go on to do is look at, from a more strategic point of view, what are the strategic changes companies need to make. And in some instances, those were connected, but in most, the strategy part is quite weak. So that's where what we said in our report to the regulator was really the transition plans. Companies' strategy for transitioning towards the Paris Agreement is the missing piece where a lot more work is needed. And we published this just for the talks in Glasgow, and we were very pleased to see that transition plans did come out of the Glasgow talk as one of the key focal areas for kind of further regulatory development. So we feel like we were at least had our finger on the pulse, if not something useful to say for that debate at that point in time. So my point behind this is to show what, in my view of what one way you can engage with regulators, which is watch for when the regulators are calling for research, because universities have a very strong credibility with regulators. I don't know who we were competing against, but I know with these contracts, you typically get some excellent consultancies that go for these as well, because it's great for their credibility too. But universities have that independence that regulators tend to trust. So academics are in a good position to do this. But academics also have their own, if you like, we have our own stereotypes of our ability to communicate, our ability to focus on the practical implications from a regulatory point of view. So we have to overcome a few of the hurdles as well before we can persuade people to commission us to do research like this. But it is great because you've then been invited by regulators to help inform the way they're going, right? So this is an excellent way of doing that. Now, it also helps if you know the regulators beforehand, because you've just been part of the debates for several years. So you've got a good feel for where their debates are, the direction of travel, what you should be talking about. But I'll come back to this later. This is more of a slide for the accountants, so I'll go over it quite quickly. But I think one of the things that's interesting about TCFD and climate scenario analysis is it requires businesses to look forwards. And a lot of the other disclosure initiatives are backwards looking. If you require people to look forwards, you're telling them you have to think about the future and tell the world how you are thinking about that future, which is a very different fundamental dynamic to what is happening with TCFD. And in a sense, when you really analyze what's going on, you're kind of asking companies to think about how the Paris Agreement affects them and how they can align with the Paris Agreement. That is, you never say that in the conversations. That doesn't come up. But when you analyze what's happening, you are connecting the Paris Agreement to the business and engaging the business in that type of thinking. And that's why I think this work really is important, because we need to get everybody thinking about how to align with the Paris Agreement, because that's how we'll keep building this momentum and this critical mass towards achieving our target, limiting warming to below 2 and pursuing efforts towards 1.5 degrees Celsius. I wanted to put up a few key trends, but really, I think I've talked about these already a little bit. So if we look at what's going to be happening in the next few years, I do think we'll see more focus on scenario analysis. The second point in that second batch is transition plans, which I think about companies talking about strategy a lot more. Auditing has received a lot of attention in academic circles for quite a long time, but is now starting to receive more regulatory attention as well. So if you know anybody who happens to be a specialist in the auditing of sustainability work, I think the next few years are going to be very exciting for those people if they want to engage with regulators. That's at least what I've been hearing and what we'll be doing more of at Metis too. And as we see, greenwashing, more and more scrutiny over it, and not just greenwashing, but SDG washing too, because SDG washing, there's even more that can fall under that umbrella, if you like. So there's a lot of scrutiny over this, and I think we're getting better at identifying when nice things are being said, but nothing is being done. And that will always, I don't think the greenwashing side will go away. And I think the risk of being accused of greenwashing is a great pressure on business to force them to go the extra mile. So actually, I hope there will always be a debate on greenwashing, because it's a really useful pressure to push people to go further. It's upsetting that it happens, but the debate is a good debate to maintain. Now, I did want to move on, because knowing that this was more of an academic ground, if you like, than usual, I did want to also talk a bit about, when I think about the impact of research, what I tend to go back to. And there's quite a lot of research out there that you can look at on this, but this book was one that changed my thinking quite a bit, if I'm honest. And I was fortunate, it was actually in a similar network to this, where we had a book group, and each year we would pick a different book and read it and meet up for 2 days to have a 2-day workshop on the book, that kind of thing. So we spent 2 days digesting Ben Flipiek's Making Social Science Matter. And it's a great book. It gives that great, fascinating background to the connections between social sciences and its relevance to broader society, where it may have gone wrong and what the opportunities are to build more relevance into the future. And I'm not going to go into the whole, depths of the book and the terminology that's used. I will definitely recommend the book. But what I'll draw out is a few of the key takeaways for me and hopefully make them somewhat digestible. Because to me, the book informs how you design your research project. And I like that. I like that it's not, once you've published a paper, how do you make sure the paper has impact? It's saying, no, the impact component starts in the design phase before you've done any research, even when you're just doing your desk-based background research on a topic. And it's saying that as the researcher who wants to produce relevant work that can have the potential for impact needs to be part of the debates in the community they care about. So for me, that community is regulators, policymaking, civil society. I suppose you could say business and finance, but I see those as typically being 2 years behind the debate. It's not calling them behind completely. There's some great leadership, but the civil society groups do a lot of the best thinking here. And if you're part of those debates, you can hope to identify the hot topics a year or two in advance of the debate before the discourse has moved on to those areas. So if we think about scenario analysis, after the Paris Agreement, looking at how TCFD had been designed in those early years, it was clear that that was a very challenging aspect, but not many people were talking about it. And that's, so before the FRC even called for this research, I was trying to build up a profile in the area of scenario analysis, for example. So being part of those discussions when new things are launched, taking that day out to really analyze it in detail, just puts you in a position where you can try to get that year or two ahead of the debate if you know the topic and you're really an expert. But it's having that almost intuition of, that's a new thing that could have a big impact. Let's take some time and have a look at it before the debate has had the time to digest everything. So it means the difficult thing though is, you know what it's like just trying to read everything that's been published. And now I'm telling you, you've got to be part of the broader debates as well. I mean, yeah, it's difficult to manage your time. But if you want to have an impact, I would find your community of people who you want to be a familiar face, who you want to consider your colleagues outside of academia in the more impact space, and make sure you're plugged into those debates, because that's where you will start spotting the things that people haven't yet spotted in academia, in the regulatory debates, in the business world, in the business press, for example. And that's a good starting point because you can get a head start, right? I think then the point is that as an academic, you shouldn't just be regurgitating what you're hearing in this outside world. You need to understand their debate, but you're not just being tested on whether you can sound like a civil society organization in how you talk about it. Your real job is to look at all of that, understand all of these different points of view, and through analyzing it through the rigor of the academic method, come up with your own perspective of what the key developments are, what the missing pieces are, how this space is likely to evolve as well. Because what academics have and are respected for is that ability to come at things with fresh insight, whether it's because they've seen so many things in similar spaces and can make those connections, or simply because they aren't sat in these debates every day. So they can remain an outsider, and being that temporary outsider or that partial outsider to key developments is so valuable. So use that position as, a temporary outsider to bring your own ideas to the debate and, test them out, but also have some conviction because you've done the analysis you need to arrive at that. And I think what happens is when you bring those two things together, you've identified hot topics before they become hot. You've identified the potential ones. And on top of that, you've made sure that by the time they become hot topics, you have a relatively authoritative academic voice on the subject already. And that's an ideal position to get yourself into, because the two things can happen. That on the one hand, you can become a kind of trusted go-to person for regulators. So whenever regulators want to talk about climate change and business, they send you an email and ask you for a call on Zoom or Teams or something. Just have a quick chat, a quick informal chat. You get invitations to the right workshops and right discussions. You basically you get a seat at the table, is what I'm saying. But it takes a lot of work to build that reputation, to get that seat at the table. But this is how you get that, and you have something relevant to say, in my experience at least. Now, I think then the question is, once you've got yourself into that position, how do you have an impact? Well, one avenue that I've already talked about is becoming that trusted advisor is useful. If you're the first person or one of the first people they think about when they want to come and talk to you, that's great. Because it means you're doing the right things and getting into the right space, and you can then maintain your position in those debates, but also hopefully have something to say because you've got yourself into those discussions. But I'd also then say, what is your message? And are you engaging a wide enough set of groups with that message as well. So if you think about this, let's say from where I'm sat, my community that I care about are the regulators, like I've said so far. Your community may well be different. So you might want to change this first question. My typical question is, what is the remit of that regulator? So if it's in the financial sector and their remit is to maintain financial stability, well, how can I tweak my message to resonate with that? Because that's the thing they care about. I'm not trying to change their remit, change their mandate, change their culture, change their whole way of thinking about the world. That's a big battle to take on. But if I can tweak my message to appeal to their core agenda, that's a really effective way of getting your foot in the door. And then be constructive. How does your message show what the regulator can do to do its work more effectively? And don't just engage the regulator with that, but all the other groups that are vying for their attention across civil society, across business, just at conferences. And because that links to this third point is, if the regulator or the community you care about are hearing that message, are they hearing it just from you as one academic, or are you sufficiently engaged with the wider debate that the message is coming through with most people that they're speaking to as well? And this is, I suppose, the way you capture this is saying shaping the discourse, having that level of engagement across everybody who's active in the debate to gradually over time try to nudge that discourse towards something that can push the regulators or give a platform for the regulators to act. And this is where, maybe yourselves publishing in the media with the outcomes from the papers that you're publishing, the work that you're doing, or even just finding the groups that do have a stronger media presence and making sure that you have a seat at the table with those groups as well. So essentially, it's a lot of work. And whether it depends on your university or your setup to know whether you have time for the amount of work involved. But it is doable. It just takes time and willingness to engage. But the thing is, for a lot of people who are in the sustainability space, hopefully we're in it to have an impact on the issues too. So in a sense, it shouldn't feel like a chore, because this is at the heart, at least this, from my view, this is at the heart of why we do the work. So it should be interesting, and you should want to be part of all of these discussions anyway. And you get that tangible feeling of, oh great, my research is actually being read by people outside of academia, potentially being found useful. So I'll start wrapping up now anyway, because I think I've probably gone on a bit too long, but just to talk about the future for Metis, we've got a couple of core work streams right now. I've talked about strategy a few times already in this, so we'll continue down that line. We're going to continue doing more about how corporations need to be thinking about changing their strategy going forward, and the kind of techniques that can be used to help that. I also talked about auditing earlier, and I think there's a huge growth in the auditing space here too, and it does more than just check people are doing it right. It helps build capacity and help people to do it better. And it's one of the key enforcement mechanisms that regulators depend on as well. So those are kind of two areas for us going forward. So if anyone's interested in those, always feel free to drop me an email or connect on LinkedIn or anything. And we're always happy to have a chat about anything in that space. Because what I really wanted to get to was these discussion points, and I'll take any questions that people have, but I just thought it was also useful to say kind of things that I'm interested in hearing from you if you've got thoughts on any of these topics, or if you want to open up a broader debate. So the first one, if you've gone through training as academics, what training or advice have you received about impact? And where do questions still remain? Whether that's about pathways for your careers, or whether it's about how to have an impact as an academic when you're under so many pressures to publish. Yeah, there's lots of questions there. On another side, more focus on climate change. How can we use the Paris Agreement to drive action? I think that question is kind of at the core of my research. I just don't often talk about it because it's not a useful way to engage regulators necessarily, but it's often how I think about the techniques I focus on. How can we embed things like the Paris Agreement within these practices that businesses are having to use? And I think since moving to Singapore and with the research we're doing at Metis, one question that's on our mind is how do we have this balanced approach to sustainable development across different regions? Because if we really just focused on tackling climate change, well, that's not going to resonate in a lot of contexts where there are other sustainable development priorities that are more important. So how do you find that balance across pursuing sustainable development in a slightly more holistic way and tailoring the approach context by context so you can gain as much traction as possible and help drive effective action? Because if you just tell everybody we have to care about climate change, you won't always get a seat at the table. You've got to find a different way of approaching the issue to convince people that action is required. But that's really everything from me. I just want to say thank you again to Indy for the invitation today. I've been looking forward to it for a while. I'll go back and raise that discussion points, but that's my email for now if you want to reach out to me, but you can also just find me on LinkedIn and connect, and I'll be happy to have any follow-up conversations. So Indy, I will pass back to you if that's okay, and thank you everybody.
Hi guys, thank you so much, Robert. That was awesome, really, and thank you for the way you sort of presented it. I think that was very useful for us postgrads to learn. And yeah, anybody has a question for Robert or a discussion point or a thought, please feel free to talk.
Yeah, that was really interesting, Robert. I'll just ask, so at some point there has to be some standardization, right? I mean, we can have all these different pieces of information be disclosed in various facets, but to the end user, if you want to use it for comparable purposes or valuation, whatever it is. So how do you see that convergence, or will it come through regulation?
It's an excellent question. It's a fascinating dynamic. I always think in-house, where does the standard begin? You know, and I think there's a really nice dynamic between the voluntary and mandatory spaces that people often talk about, where a lot of excellent work is done in the voluntary spaces. If you look at things like carbon accounting, it's been driven by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Now they're not even a voluntary initiative. They're used by other voluntary groups. And I think a lot of the excellent thinking and work is done in that space. And then once it gains enough traction, you find regulators can look at it and go, okay, we can take that on board and just tweak it here and here. And I think there's an interesting piece of work to be done on, you know, as we have smaller and smaller states in, say, Western or developed economies or whatever, however you want to put it, the regulators depend on civil society to do that work, to design a standard that they tweak. So it might not be in all contexts that you see that. You might have other contexts with a stronger state that they can design their own regulations much more because they have the resources. I think what's interesting to see more recently is the formation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, though, because to me that's the biggest move in the standardization space. I think I would not say that the accounting standard setters have ignored sustainability, but I think they have watched the space very closely and decided when the right time is to come on board, to join the discussion, the debate. I think what we've seen since the Paris Agreement, what we've seen with the amount of traction behind corporate action on climate, the space, it feels like it's the right time for the accounting standard setters to have a stronger voice. I think they figured that out, and that's where they've managed to form the ISSB. So I think that's a really important one to watch in terms of standardization. My suspicion from I don't know if you've seen the exposure drafts that came out from the ISSB, but I think what you'll find is that they give a lot of respect to the work that's been done in the voluntary space as well. So they don't try to reinvent all of those standards, but maybe they find where they need to be tweaked a little bit as well. That would be my suspicion. How it evolves, I don't know, but I know they wanted to get something out quickly, and that to me seems the most effective way they can do that. But I do agree standards are needed to make, I think, to help companies use this effectively. You then will almost need industry handbooks as well. So you can have, hey, here's the global standard on biodiversity. What does that mean in the water sector? And I don't know who that comes from. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol have created those for cement, for finance, for all these carbon intensive sectors. So maybe it'll come from the voluntary space. I've also been involved in a project with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where they brought energy companies together to develop something like that. And we were the advisors to that project, and they And that was more of a business-led kind of guidance. So I completely agree, you need standards. The standards can be really hard to digest for business as well, though. So you also need a bridge between the standard and the industry, I think, to almost to mediate between the global perspective and the more specific world. But also very eager to hear your thoughts, Helen, as well, if you have a view on where things are going from that standards.
I mean, it's interesting because, I mean, Europe has really pushed, right? It's already got a whole taxonomy, and it's kind of saying we need everyone else to adopt what we're putting in place. And I mean, there are certainly advantages to that, but it doesn't always necessarily be a one-size-fits-all kind of application.
Definitely.
I mean, if I look at New Zealand, you know, the intensification of dairy here and just the consequences of that from a carbon emissions point of view. So, yeah, I think, you know, Europe's been a fast first mover, or at least organizations in Europe. So, yeah, how that plays out across the globe is not clear yet, as you say, but obviously, yeah, as practice gets adopted, it does become easier to regulate it, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I always like to, when this kind of Europe taking the lead thing comes up, I like to think back to Calonne has a paper in AOS in 2009 on in vitro and in vivo experiments. And seeing these developments as mini experiments, I think, is quite useful. Because I think out of Europe there can be a message of this is a way of doing it that can be adopted more broadly. Trying to take that with a pinch of salt if it's not too offensive to other contexts. But I think that kind of looking at what happens elsewhere and saying that's an experiment. What did they learn? What can we learn? How would we do it differently? Is a constructive kind of engagement with it.
Right.
But yeah, it's yeah, you can often get messages out of Europe and North America that is, hey, we've got a standard, here's how to do it. And it's not that respective that the world is full of different places.
Right. Cool. Yeah, I agree.
Indy, I was keen to ask you about one of these discussion points. I can take these down. It's not enough. Just see one of them. How much training do you get in your PhD, for example, or at conferences or broader conversations about how academics have an impact?
I'm still doing my master's, so I think the idea of impact comes from, personally for me, it comes from, I've always been encouraged by my supervisors or the type of work I want to do, specifically to do it in sort of action research or immersion research. And being predominantly in systems and management accounting, it lends itself to do that, you know, to go into the field, to experience what the other person's experiencing. And yeah, I could actually kind of give that back to you as a question. So I do sort of consult on and off on small matters to very small or medium organizations. And one of the things I find difficult with the sort of the academic training is that we are so hard trained, I think, to deep dive into a topic. So if I'm doing a report or a deep dive for the organization, I'm on my game. I just noticed you had some best practice suggestions, and I'm like, but that's my weakness personally. I'm like, they asked for best practice or overview insights. I'm like, I've always had to have a lot of feedback back as a student consultant, and I have to work over and over again to present them. So there's sort of a language or taxonomy difference between how the industry views some of these concerns, especially materiality, SDG washing, and how we are trained to do it as postgrads. So any advice or guidance on that is very welcome, because I'm pretty sure there are other postgrads who, you know, hustle on the side in this manner, and it'll be very welcome. And it's very well established academics who struggle as well in that distilling down, not only distilling the core message, which is hard enough by itself, but distilling the core message that's relevant to that audience is one of the
I was given some advice about writing in general in academia, which was on the wall behind your monitor, have a few post-it notes of the names of people you're writing for. Because the audience, if you think of the whole community as your audience, it's too big. But if you can think of 3 or 4 people who you want to write for, you can imagine you're writing to them and it helps you focus. But I think when I'm doing this with reports, I do a similar thing now of who are the people in business that I'd be really trying to write to. So let's say you've met people through your field work or you've met people in the communities you're engaging with. Just imagining that you're writing it to those people. I think in a way is when you have to think about that every time you're at your keyboard, it trains you to have this different style of writing depending on the audience.
Right.
So to me, I would look at it, on the one hand, that is just a good practice to have for the years ahead. And don't stop doing it ever would be my take, because that to me is, thank you, Helen. To me, it's that how over time you find your voice or multiple voices depending on your audience. Yeah. I would also then say, try out with friends and family and all this. When you talk, when they're saying, so what are you working on? Saying, well, we're doing this, and what we found is, and test those best practice recommendations and test those key messages and see which ones resonate and how much you have to do to tweak them until people get it.
Yeah.
Because again, you're trying to sit in between multiple communities, academia, practice, regulation, potentially. And the more you force yourself to articulate things in a way that gains traction and people just get it straight away, the better you're going to get. So I just test these things out is really the message in my view. And don't, in some settings, don't be scared of oversimplifying as well. I think when you go through academic training, you're often writing for your supervisors or for the academics that you know. And there's almost pressure for that level of precision, that really careful explanation, which is great training. But for certain communities, they don't have the patience for that type of writing. And a core message that gets it across and grabs their attention is more effective, because then they'll ask follow-up questions. And then you can gradually peel back the layers of how complex this is, but in a way that holds their hand through the whole thing. So very different communication styles. And if you're going through the academic training, you're probably too focused on writing for academics and not enough for your best mate who's in business or something like that. You know? And if you've got their name behind your monitor on the wall, it'll just help you focus on how can I write this one sentence for them.
Solid advice, thank you.
Practical, hopefully.
I hope so, yeah.
I'll
test it and get back to you. I'm getting new post-it notes now.
Good.
Thank you so much for your time, Robert. Thank you for doing this for us postgrads. And guys, you've got his email. So if there's any question, feel free to shoot it and keep in touch.
I missed Robert's email address, by the way.
Oh, I can bring it back up now. You can also find me on LinkedIn. I'll share my screen again now.
We are connected in LinkedIn as well.
Yeah. If you want to drop me an email, there we go. I'll leave that up while we're signing off. But yeah, I'm quick on LinkedIn. I'm actually on medical leave this week, so if you do send me an email, you'll get an out of office saying that the doctor's told me I'm unfit for duty. So, sorry about that, Andy.
No worries, Rob. Cheers.
Thank you, Sakib, and I see you from Bangladesh as well. I hope, good morning, I'm guessing. It's an early start for you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for your time, and hopefully see you in Wellington, Robert.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Hopefully in December.